Welcome to this episode of the Think and Reform podcast. My name is Luke Saint. Thank you so much for listening. Head over to futureofchristendom.org for announcements. We have our October conference coming up, America Reforged. And head over to futureofchristendom.org for more information on that. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel where the latest videos from and presentations from our last conference, our Lancastrian Theonomy Symposium, where we talked about capital punishment and what the Bible has to say about that. That's all on futureofchristendom.org with debates. And we have T-shirts for sale and hoping to get a couple extra T-shirts up there for sale as well. And we have books for sale. And we have conferences, and the content from all those conferences is up on our YouTube channel as well. So today's not going to be a very long one. I'm looking to hopefully next time react to the part 2 of Reformation Red Pill's interview with Stephen Wolfe, Dr. Stephen Wolfe. And there's some great content that they produced there for us to discuss on this channel. We're going to do Ask a Theonomist first. And the question I had from my friend Alan, who always sends me very good questions. He asked, what do we do about the distribution of fake AI-generated child porn? And he's interested, like, in a theonomic society where God's law is the only law of the land. What do we do about that? And I don't see any sort of state control over that. First, the state can't control that. It can only really regulate it. And the reason I say that, and I'll explain here in a second why I'm saying that. But the state can't control that, and it could technically outlaw it. But in theonomic society, there would be no legislature. So what will we do about somebody producing, AI-generated, pornography and even child porn? And this is not a new question. This is an old question. There was hand-drawn pornography distributed since, I would probably guess, since the dawn of time. We've been creating fake human-generated pornography ever since people have picked up a pencil. So I don't think, AI generated, I don't see any sort of state penalty for this person if he's just viewing it for himself. If he's trying to distribute it, what God's law does in this situation is it doesn't protect people who are distributing things like this. Right? God's law does not protect you. You are at a societal and cultural disadvantage if you, in God's system, if you were to decide to start distributing this and, let's see, like approaching people looking to sell it and things like that. Because someone could choose to beat you up. Or, in God's system, if someone approaches another person and offers to sell them child pornography, whether it's real or fake, God's system has, what is it? What is the... God's system has... in Deuteronomy chapter 25, I don't know what version this is. Contemporary English version. What the heck is that? Let's go to ESV. If there is a dispute between men and they come into court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. So that's available to the judges. Now, this is not a general punishment that's available to the judges just for whatever, right? There has to be a dispute between a man and another man, and they come into the court and the judges decide between them, right? This can't be. I don't see. I mean, maybe someone could make an argument, but I do not see this applying to somebody who's producing fake AI porn in his own house and he gets discovered. Maybe you could. Maybe you could bring him out and flog him or whatever. Maybe you could say it applies to that. But this, from what I understand, this passage here requires two men. It's got to be a dispute between two people. So if this person who's producing this fake AI porn chooses to try and sell to somebody else, then I think this would apply. You could be flogged for that. But I also see in God's system that people who decide to be sexually impure and obscene are at a disadvantage because someone could, ostensibly, take matters into his own hands and beat this pornographer up himself, and the pornographer wouldn't have a case in court if he brought the person who beat him up and said, "Hey, this guy's he beat me up." Oh, why'd he beat you up? Well, it was because I tried to sell him child pornography, or he caught me, viewing fake child pornography or whatever. The judge is not going to, he's not going to punish the guy who punished him. So in God's system, remember, the person who's in sin is always at a perpetual disadvantage. Now, this is why we have judges, because sometimes somebody who's in sin maybe doesn't deserve to be beat up by somebody else, right? Maybe he called your mom fat or something like that, and the guy, beat him within an inch of his life. Well, you have a judge there to say, okay, that the punishment doesn't fit the crime, or the punishment doesn't, you can't go around beating people up because they insulted your mom, and that's why we have judges, to be able to look at these things and use their common sense, and the biblical law promotes the application of common sense in the courtroom, whereas man-made law, punishes it, really. So to answer Alan's question, this would only be applicable, again, if there's somebody in their own home just producing it. First off, nobody's really going to know. Secondly, I see flogging as the appropriate punishment for that offense. If this person's trying to sell it to other people, if you discover a ring or something like that. Now, the reason I say you can't regulate it through the government is Chris Hume a while back did a podcast on this issue of how do we outlaw pornography. Well, you can't outlaw pornography the same way you can't outlaw guns. Okay. What you can do is give the righteous freedom to push back against the encroachment of that wickedness into their communities and in their homes, right? And you can't do that. You can't give the righteous freedom through man-made law, right? God's law is the only one that provides that necessary freedom. And the reason I say that is, okay, first off, again, make the connection to drugs. We've outlawed drugs. You can get drugs anywhere, right? Drugs are very accessible. They're affordable. You can outlaw and try and control guns, but you can get guns even in countries where they're outlawed. Obviously, all the criminals have them somehow magically. Let me just. I guess I can turn this down, right? As my Facebook notifications are going off. Let me read to you, and Chris did a podcast about this. So if you go to Lancaster Patriot and you look for this episode, is probably about 2 years, maybe a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. And I'm going to read to you the law that Dusty Devers of which Dusty Devers was the author, I think. Who authors? Oh, okay. They're not listing the authors here, but I'm pretty sure the original author was Dusty Devers and maybe a friend or two. But let's just read okay? Dusty Devers, Christian, very explicit Christian, wants to abolish abortion, very consistent on that. In Oklahoma, this is Senate Bill 593, okay? And it turns, let's read some of the language here, okay? And you'll see what I'm talking about. Be it enacted by the people of the state of Oklahoma, Section 1, amendatory, some technical language here. Okay. Sections 1024.1 through sections 1040.24 of this title, child sexual abuse material means any visual depiction of a child engaged in any act of sexually explicit conduct. And they go in to define what child pornography is here. And they define child, they define obscene, okay? And they say this many times throughout this bill, and this is why I just think you're whistling Dixie with this kind of stuff, okay? Obscene means any performance or depiction in any form or on any medium if the material, when taken as a whole, A, appears to the prurient interest in sex as determined by the average person applying the contemporary standards of their community. That one's, kind of vague. Depicts, represents, or displays sexually explicit conduct in a patently offensive way. Okay. And this is the one I have a problem here. This is said several times throughout the bill. C, a reasonable person would find the material or performance lacks serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific value. Now, this is a Christian putting this language into this bill. Okay? A reasonable person would find the material or performance lacks serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific value. This is a problem right now with a lot of the indie films and artistic films, is that they're already displaying, what is known as underage children, right? Like 15, 16-year-olds, like you can get these movies from France or something like that, or Germany, or, goodness knows, Czechoslovakia, I'm not sure, or the Czech Republic, or you can find technical what our country would define as child porn, right? And it's under the guise, so if it's okay, it's art. And here's this bill written by a Christian basically saying, is this not the whole crux of the abolitionists and pro-life? And respectfully to Dusty Devers, my question would be, what's the difference between this and pro-lifism, right? Where a reasonable person would find the material or performance lacks serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific value. So if a reasonable person found that the material or performance did not lack serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific value, that means it's legal. In what circumstance would the above language be justified as being scientific, literary, political, educational? What is that? Are they trying to protect like sex education in school? I mean, what's being protected here? I don't understand this, right? As somebody who, I'm totally sold out for the abolitionist argument. I think it's completely 100% consistent. This looks like the pro-life version of pornography here. Like they're just regulating it. Like this bill basically says it's okay if it doesn't lack serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific value. Tell me I'm wrong. And Dusty Devers is as serious a Christian as they come. And this is what they're putting through here. Okay, we go into, and they get very explicit with what this all means, and they're trying to outlaw a whole bunch of stuff here. Okay, right. So a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to say on here. And they're defining, visual depiction, what that means. And then they go into a very long section here. I guess this is an amendment. D, it is the intent of the legislature that every provision, section, subsection, sentence, clause, phrase, or word in the definition of unlawful pornography is severable from each other, such that if any of the listed items is found by a court to be invalid or unconstitutional, the remaining items will be severed and may not be affected. All constitutionally valid applications of this section shall be severed from any application that a court finds to be invalid, leaving the valid application in force, because it is the intent and priority of the legislature that the valid applications be allowed to stand alone. A lot of this is legalese here, and I'm struggling to understand what is actually being said. Let me just kind of skip to the end here. If any court declares or finds a provision of this section facially unconstitutional, when discrete applications of that provision can be enforced against a person's, group of persons, or circumstances without violating the United States Constitution and Oklahoma Constitution, those applications shall be severed from all remaining applications of the provision, and their provision shall be interpreted as if the legislature had enacted a provision limited to that person, group of persons, or circumstances for which the provision's application will not violate the United States Constitution and Oklahoma Constitution. That's a lot of legalese. I'm not really sure what they're saying, but it appears to me from that they're like saying this will not apply if that person who is practicing a constitutionally protected right. That's just what it seems to me there, to be there. Yeah, it's a lot of it is legally. If any provision of this section is found by any court to be unconstitutionally vague, then the application of that provision that do not present constitutional vagueness problems shall be severed and remain in force. No court may decline to enforce the severability requirements of the section on the grounds that severance would rewrite the statute or involve the court in legislative or lawmaking activity. And here we go again. F. Each of the items of unlawful pornography in paragraph 6 of subsection C of this section are depictions of sexual conduct which are patently offensive under contemporary community standards in this state and have as their dominant theme an appeal to prurient interest in sex under contemporary community standards of this state, and may not be produced or distributed within the state if they lack serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific purpose or value. So I'm learning three things from this bill. One, the ultimate standard is the Constitution. Secondly, we're defining pornography there seems to be a definition here or a standard of pornography that appeals to the contemporary community standards of this state. And three, it's all okay if it can be bundled as a serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific purpose. And I'm just looking at this and going, I think this is really bad. I think this is really bad that the ultimate standards of the Constitution says nothing about the Bible in here, which like on some level, I get. I see what they're trying to do, or what he's trying to do. I just think it's an exercise in futility. That's only going to punish, in my opinion, will temporarily, punish wicked people, but it's going to come around and start punishing the righteous people. Because the magistrate, once he finds pornography, he's got to confiscate it. It's got to go into evidence. And then that means the magistrate's allowed to have pornography and we're not, right? Secondly, there's an appeal in here to the contemporary community standards of the state, which is a relative standard, right? I'm sure the contemporary community standards of California are much different than the contemporary community standards of Oklahoma. And I give it about one generation until Oklahoma becomes just like California. Right? This is like such a Band-Aid on a huge gaping hole, in my opinion, that does not need a Band-Aid, but needs triage. And the third thing is, again, coming back to this, it's allowed if it has serious literary, artistic, educational, political, or scientific value. And again, the court is the definer of those things. And I'm just wondering how a Christian could author something like this and put his name on it. I don't think it's consistent at all. I'm sure he has got his reasons for it. And I'm not saying this doesn't make him a Christian. He's not a Christian anymore. And it doesn't make him a pro-lifer. I think it's inconsistent with abolitionism, with immediatism. I think it's completely inconsistent. This looks like pro-lifism to me. But I can't think of a better bill, or I've never seen anyone even trying to pass a bill that's trying to outlaw pornography. And I see what they're trying to do, right? It's a respectable aim. I get it. But this bill right here, Senate Bill 593, by Devers. There it is, right there. This is proof to me. Or it's a proof, it's an exhibit, H, that the battle of pornography cannot be fought by the state. They can't fight it. It cannot be, we cannot wave the magic wand of legislation and expect any sort of victory over pornography. It's not going to happen. This cannot be fought through the state. This is I should say the state I'm not saying the state can't ever be involved, but I am saying trying to outlaw this using our idea of using statism, trying to get fight fire with fire, I guess. In my opinion, you're calling in the wolves to chase off the dogs. It's going to do more harm than good. I think temporarily you'll get away with some stuff, and maybe it'll be good for a while. But you give the state this kind of control into your life, and that is control, because you're basically giving them control over your computer with this. It's going to come back and haunt you, and the statists will use this as an example. Hey, we outlawed pornography, so look, now we're going to outlaw this, and then we're going to outlaw that, and blah 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 blah. It will be used as precedent to trample your so-called rights. It's in my opinion, it's calling the wolves to chase off the dogs. And I think it's completely inconsistent with the Christian worldview. This whole thing, beginning to end, whole thing. The second thing I wanted to do is in Ask a Theonomist is okay. This question right here in Theonomy Q&A. It's a Facebook group where we just talk about theonomy. And he got an article here. And the question is, how does the Bible view marriage in this case? What if the conjoined twins are male? And the article is about conjoined twins who share the same body, who got married. And I just want to point out something here. In biblical law, there's no rush to find something wrong with this. Do you understand what I'm saying? The Bible says that marriage isn't for everyone, right? But in something like this, if we're talking about what do we do in this situation? In God's society, there is God's law doesn't really put a burden on you to go looking for problems that are not your business, right? This is such a rare case, but there's no need to let's establish the policy before we get to a theocracy. Let's figure out the definite yes or definite no on this one. This kind of situation is for the people who know these women, know the man, and know what's really going on in this situation. If someone is around them and they're like, yes, I know this is definitely provable in court that adultery is happening in this situation, then let them bring the case, right? But in God's society, these what about in this situation is really great for discussion. But I want to encourage theonomists who are looking at this and trying to figure out, well, I gotta find the answer before I promote a theonomic society or a theocracy and stuff like that. No, you don't have to. right? Because most of us don't know these people. We're not going to come across a situation in our lifetime, right? Really weird, nuanced situations like this are for people who are in that community who know these people. Let them bring this before a judge. Let them, prosecute. All right. And when you're thinking about like trying to establish justice in the land, and there's this really weird situation where these conjoined twins get married, does that mean it's adultery? Let's figure this out before we try to promote. And I'm not saying the person who's involved in this discussion, who posted this article, is saying, "Quick, let's figure it out." But I look at this and I'm just looking at this and I'm going, I don't know. I would probably guess it looks like adultery to me because I see two souls here, and I don't know how it's all going on, but in God's system, since God's law is not something that you need to read and find every single possible application in these weird nuanced situations before you establish it as the law of the land, allows me to look at that and go, well, if I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, right? Most of the time, it's going to be, let the Lord be the judge. And that, I think, is a blessing from God's law, because the statists are the ones who are always trying to put every sort of nuance into law. Like they don't like a nuance where there's no law. We gotta every time there's nuance, we gotta put it into law. I mean, if you go back and read Senate Bill 593, they're trying to get every single nuance and account for every single what about, right? And the result of that oftentimes is that every time you try to account for something, it's ultimately used against you in the future, right? Because you worded something wrong, you used the wrong phrase, you were too specific or you were too vague, and now the person can view it as a permission where you're trying to outlaw something. It's now viewed as a permission to do that very thing. Just like in that bill where they're trying to outlaw pornography, but they say you can do it if it's art. I'm not joking you. That's what it says. But in God's system, there's no need to let's quick find every single nuance and put it into law before we, establish our society or make a system where we have the ability to legislate every nuance. That's looking at it from the eyes of a statist. You don't need to do that as a theonomist. God's law is something that's very relaxed, because it's a very relaxed system for the people who live in it, because the burden of thinking about these things and judging these things is ultimately on God and his law. That's really where the burden is. It does all the heavy lifting for us. And there's no need for us to try and figure out and wrestle with every nuance before we do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. You can do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God without defining every nuance. The statists can't do that. Every time there's a nuance, we got to get a session together and decide how we're going to judge this nuance, and then just more tyranny comes out of it. So I just want to point that out for when you come across these nuanced situations in God's law. The application of God's law is such that, and God's system is very relaxed, and there's no need to quick find out, how this applies and, stuff like that. So I was listening to the Foolish and Offensive podcast, and which is run by my dad and Pastor Matt Kenitzer, and Matt Kenitzer, let's see here. Can I zoom in here? How can I zoom in? Okay, here we go. This was sent to Pastor Matt Kenitzer, who's the author of, obviously he's part of Future for Christendom, and he does several lectures for us. And he authored a book called According to the Glorious Gospel, which is non-legislative theonomy through the perspective of a pastor. You can find that at futureofchristendom.org and on Amazon. So this was sent to him, and it's filled with a lot of really great questions, and they address these questions on the latest episode of the Foolish and Offensive podcast. So go check that out, Future of Christendom, and on our YouTube channel, Future of Christendom. And so I'm going to take a stab at it as well, because it's such really great questions. It's written by somebody who does not agree with what we're saying out here on our podcast and at Future of Christendom. So here is the email that was sent to him. I'm going to read it for you in full, and then we'll go through and we'll answer each one. Matt, here are a few questions concerning how God's people relate to civil government. 1, would you agree that Romans 13, 1-7 was written to Roman Christians? 2, would you agree that every soul to be subject to the higher government powers? Would you agree that every soul is to be subject to the higher government powers? 3, would you agree that there is no civil government power but by God's approval? 4, would you agree that whosoever resists the higher government power is resisting the ordinance of God? 5, would you agree that whoever resists the ordinance of God shall themselves receive judgment? 6, would you agree that God's people who do good are not to be afraid of the higher government power? 7, would you agree that if God's people do good, they shall or ought to receive praise from the higher power? 8, would you agree that the higher government power is a minister of God placed in power for the good of God's people? 9, would you agree if God's people do evil, they should be afraid, for the government power does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God as an avenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil? Would you agree that because God set up the civil government power for the purpose listed above, then God's people must be subject to the higher government power, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake? God's people paid tribute, tax, to the higher civil government powers because these civil government powers are ministers who attend continually to carry out the duties assigned to them by God as his ministers. Matt, based on the about point set forth by Paul to the Roman believers, what is the biblical basis for the Future of Christendom group teaching God's people to do the following: reject, undermine, defund, deny the legitimacy of legislation, reject and dismantle the state? If the civil government power is put in place by God for the good of God's people, why would God's people want to undermine, reject, defund, deny, and dismantle it when God's people know that doing such a thing makes them liable to be punished? If I ask the above question at one of your church meetings, would you answer or remain silent? That's a weird question, but whatever. God will deal with his ordained civil government ministers. His people must trust that God knew what he was doing when he made the civil government powers. His ministers for the good of his people. To me, the civil powers are the ordained ministers and servants of God put in place to execute wrath in time and history on evildoers for the good of his people, and his people ought not to undermine and dismantle what God has established for our good. That's the whole email. So my dad responded to this. My dad brought up a good point, one that I probably would not have said, but I want to reiterate a point that he brought up. He said, regarding that weird question, where is it? If I ask the above questions at one of your church meetings, would you answer or remain silent? And my dad brought up the point, like, we have been looking for people to talk about these things. Like we would love to have a discussion. We've been inviting people all the time, looking to have discussions about these things, and people they won't do it. They're too afraid, right? So it's such a weird question that this person who's ostensibly been watching our material would even think that Matt Kenitzer would remain silent when we at Future of Christendom are constantly looking to have this discussion with anyone and everyone, who is willing to discuss it. Okay, so let's go through these one at a time here. Here are a few questions concerning how God's people relate to civil government. Number 1, would you agree that Romans 13, 1-7 was written to Roman Christians? Now I'm going to answer this from my perspective. Yes, I would. Number 2, would you agree that every soul is to be subject to the higher government powers? Yes, I would. Right? Number 3, would you agree that there's no civil government power but by God's approval? No, I would not. So let me go back to number 3. Would you agree that there is no civil? Number 2. Would you agree that every soul is to be subject to the higher government powers? So let's go to Romans 13. Take a look at this real quick, and why I would qualify that the same way Paul qualifies that. Right? Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So the therefore, right there in verse 5, therefore. I don't think this, most Christians read this, and again, we insert our statism into it and basically read a dictator into it. I don't think this passage is teaching that the government has the ability, the right, or the responsibility, the authority to punish disobedience to the magistrate, right? It's not a blank check to punish disobedience to the magistrate, right? That's not what it's saying here. The therefore, one must be in subjection. Why? Because he is God's servant for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the very last sentence before the therefore. The last sentence before the therefore is, for he is God, the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, you must be in subjection. Are we in subjection because he is God's servant? No, that's not why we're in subjection. We're in subjection because he is an avenger, he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection. Okay? The therefore is there for a reason, right? So the therefore, the last sentence before the therefore is, he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. That's the qualification. He's not someone who comes along and says, I've been voted in office, now you come and now you have to listen to me. Everything I say, you got to listen to. Why? Because Romans 13 says, just you have to listen to me. All right? Everything I say. And what a lot of people will do, what a lot of people will do is they'll read into this, the application of this. There's this silent law in here that's being promoted, and it is the context or the application of this is you have to listen to everything they tell you to do. If it's stupid, if it's silly, if it doesn't make sense, as long as they're not making you sin. That's the application here, but that's not what it says. Verse 5, therefore one must be in subjection because he is God's avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer, not on the person who's being disobedient. That's not always the same thing. The person who's being disobedient to the authorities is not always the wrongdoer. Hey, look at me. The person who's in disobedience is not always the person who's doing the wrongdoing. Sometimes it's good to be disobedient to the magistrate, right? Even if he's not asking you to sin, it's fine. A lot of people in the Bible did it all the time. Okay? A lot of people did it in the Bible all the time. The magistrate was not asking them to sin. They said, no, I'm not going to listen to you. Okay? Happens all the time. So this Paul and Peter both qualify it. Be subject to the governing authorities as those who praise those who do good and punish those who do evil. Okay? That's the qualification. There's a qualification in here that most people just glibly, they just go over it because they're unfamiliar with God's law. They don't know what God's law says. There's no standard. So the law becomes the law of the state or the law of the jungle. And it becomes arbitrary. You have to listen to them just because they made a law, right? It doesn't matter if they're violating their God-given responsibility and they're punishing people who aren't doing anything wrong, right? Speeding, you're not doing anything wrong, okay? Everyone does it. We all do it. You do 65 and 55, that's speeding, right? But you're not sinning, okay? And if you don't go report yourself to the magistrate, I'm sorry, 165 and 55, please, send me a ticket, all right? You're not in sin. God's not going to judge us by Pennsylvania state law, okay? So, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good and you will receive his approval. Okay, does that describe Rome to you? Does that describe the Romans? Jesus Christ was put to death by Rome. Was he doing what was good? All right. Does that describe Pontius Pilate? It wasn't the Jews who crucified Christ. They got him crucified, but who were the ones who drove the nails in? It was Rome, right? They're the ones who crucified Christ. They're the ones who beat him. They mocked him too, right? It was the Romans as well, right? It wasn't just the Jews. What was going on there, right? Was Jesus Christ doing something bad that he needed to fear? I mean, does this describe Rome? For rulers are not a terror of good conduct, but to bad. Does that describe Rome? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. He's not talking about Rome here. So let's go back to the email. So, number 2, would you agree that every soul is to be subject to higher government powers if they're doing their job? Yes, you are to be subject. And I believe what's being taught there in Peter when it says be subject for Christ's sake, right? Even if the state is telling you to do something and it's not necessarily under their authority, for the sake of Christ, I think we should be submissive, right? For the sake of Christ. But that means in something different to everyone in every situation. So let the Lord be the judge of that one. Number 3, would you agree there is no civil government power but by God's approval? No. I would not agree with that. And they brought this up in the other podcast too. Okay. Hosea 8:4. Where is it? They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. How did that happen? Right? They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. So I would not agree with that question. Would you agree? Would you agree that there's no civil power but by God's approval? No, I wouldn't. No, because God does not approve of some civil power, of some civil powers, just like he doesn't approve of the Pope, right? It says all authorities from God. Nothing in here. Okay, so here it is. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. That includes the Pope. It's not. It doesn't say only civil liberty, only civil authority here. It doesn't just say that. Only civil authority. It says there is no authority except from God. Now you can say, "Oh, the Pope's not an authority." Well, he's going to tell you he is. Are you resisting God when you resist the Pope? Did not God put him into power? Was he there by accident? Do you resist the Pope? All the Protestants are going to say, yes, we don't listen to the Pope. We don't even listen to the Queen of England or the King of England. Right? Where in this passage does it say anything about jurisdiction? Only listen to the ones in in your congressional district. Where does it say that? It says all authority. So that means if the King of England comes over here, he gives you an order, hey, defect and come and join England. I guess you got to do that, right? Because this says nothing about local jurisdiction. Nothing. So that means if the Pope gives us an order, we have to listen to him. And if the King of England gives us an order, we have to listen. If the King of freaking Zimbabwe gives you an order, right? If the local chief from the Zulus, the Zulu nation, Zululand, and comes over here and he gives you an order, you got to listen to him. He's authority set up by God. Sorry. We all know that this passage is not saying that. Stop it with the silliness. So, number 3, would you agree there's no civil government power by God's approval? No. I believe all civil powers are there by God's divine decree, But doesn't mean that God expects us to submit to every last one of them, as I just demonstrated. Number 4, would you agree that whoever resists the higher government power is resisting the ordinance of God? No, I would not. I would not agree with that. Would you agree that whoever resists the higher government power is resisting the ordinance of God? No, and nobody believes that. Nobody, again, if the King of England comes over here and gives you an order, that's the voice of God, is it not? Right? Would you agree that whoever resists the higher government power is resisting the ordinance of God? And this is what I keep saying. A lot of Christians walk around, they believe the police are the voice of God. This question right here demonstrates it. When the policeman says, exit your vehicle, that's not the cop telling you to do that. That's the voice of God telling you to do that. That's how they treat Romans 13. It's the literal voice of God. Not literal, but it's essentially it's the essential voice of God. Whenever the police gives you an order, you got to listen to it, because it's not the police giving it to you; it's from God Himself. And so, when you speed, you're actually not rejecting a man-made arbitrary ordinance. You are actually in sin from God. And they always run to speed because it's the safe one. But none of these people. And Pastor Matt and my dad pointed this out in their podcast. None of these people go to their township and read all the ordinances and follow them. Nobody cares. None of them care. You don't care. Whoever wrote this, he doesn't care about his local ordinance. He doesn't follow it. When there's a burn ban, that his township posts, or if there's some sort of building code, he's not going to follow it. Nobody believes that. We just go with the safe one to nickel and dime other Christians from trying to affect positive change and secure the future, and secure freedom and prosperity for ours and our what's the phraseology there? For us and our children, I think. Us and our posterity. For our posterity. So nobody agrees. Nobody thinks that. Not one single person on earth thinks that every single law is the voice of God. Nobody believes that. We just do that with the safe ones. Number 5, would you agree that whoever resists the ordinance of God shall themselves receive judgment? Yes, the ordinance of God. And the ordinance of God is for the magistrate to be punishing those who are doing evil. If you're doing something that's not evil and you're being punished, right? You are not being punished by the ordinance of God. You're being punished by the ordinance of man, right? God's law doesn't punish you. God doesn't punish you for doing what's right. There's no punishment from God for doing what is right. The caveat there, the qualification in Romans 13, you must be doing something evil for the state to interact with you. They don't define evil. They don't get to make up what evil is. Okay, it's now evil not to wear a mask. Okay, that's not their role. That's not their responsibility. They don't have the authority from God to redefine evil. Yesterday, it wasn't evil to wear a mask. It wasn't evil to walk around with no mask. Today, it is. Right? Now it's evil for you not to socially distance and stand 6 feet apart. That is not evil. So that means it's outside of the jurisdiction of the magistrate. Don't argue with me. That's what Paul said. Here it says, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. You know what was good during COVID? Not wearing a mask and not socially distancing. Not shutting down your business. Do you think the magistrate was rewarding people for that? Do you think they were praising those who were doing good? When they're walking out on the beach arresting people for being out on the freaking beach? That's asinine. So no, would you agree that whoever resists the ordinance of God shall themselves receive judgment? Yes, but it's got to be the ordinance of God, not the ordinance of man. And most 99, probably 100, to be just rounding it off, 100% of all the laws that we experience today are the ordinance of men. Most of them do not punish you for doing something evil. In fact, our rulers are a terror to good conduct, and they praise those who do evil. Have you seen the White House lit up with the rainbow? Number 6, would you agree that God's people who do good are not to be afraid of the higher government power? I would not agree with that. No. Ideally, yes, I would agree with that. Right now, no, because doing good would be to give all your money to your children, but the state swoops parachutes in and they say, halt right there. To quote Brian Regan, halt right there, and hand over a chunk of the stuff you're going to leave behind for your kids, called inheritance tax. Right. So the right thing to do is to give your kids as much money as you can and pass down as much of your capital to the next generation to help them. But you get punished for that. You have to give a lot of it to the state. But you're not doing anything wrong. So why do you have to give it to the state? So would you agree that God's people who do good are not to be afraid of the higher government power? Yes. People who are doing good should not be afraid of the higher government power who is faithful to God. If you're not faithful to God, then eventually you're going to be afraid of them, because since they're not faithful to God, they don't know how to do justice. They don't know what it is. And they're going to start punishing innocent people. Innocent people shouldn't be afraid of the government. But have you been to America? There's a lot of innocent people out there really afraid of the government. People who sell raw milk and try to serve their neighbor by selling them baked goods. They're afraid that the government's going to find out and come out and punish them. Why? I would bet you the person who wrote this email would be like, yep, the person selling raw milk without a license should be punished by the government. Because people who write emails like this believe in, respectfully to this person, they're legalists. Because they believe that the state defines good and evil outside of God's law. They have that authority from God, Romans 13, where it doesn't say anything like that. They just read it in there. And people who write emails like this think that to honor God is to follow every jot and tittle, not of God's law, but of man-made law. That's legalism, holiness through man-made law. Number 7, would you agree that if God's people do good, they shall or ought to receive praise from the higher power? Absolutely, yes, I would agree. They shall or ought to receive praise from the higher power. And you had to phrase it this way because that's not happening nowadays. I don't know of anybody who receives praise for doing the right thing from the magistrate. Would you agree that the higher government, number 8, would you agree that the higher government power is a minister of God placed in power for the good of God's people? I agree that it should be, just like the Pope should be a servant of God for the people of God, but he isn't. He's got a lot of power. He's got a lot of authority. He should use that for good if he finds himself in that position, but he doesn't. And so that makes him a terror to good works. That makes him a terror to Christians, as his papal bulls and his made up laws and canons and things like that punish righteous behavior and reward wicked behavior. So would you agree that the higher government power is a minister of God placed in power for the good of God's people? Yes, but that does not automatically mean that everybody who's been voted into office is somebody who's a minister of God. They should be a minister of God, but you got to act like one, right? Number 9, would you agree if God's people do evil, they should be afraid? For the government power does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God as an avenger to execute wrath upon him who does evil. Of course, that's a situation that's ideal. And he goes on, he stops counting his questions here. This will be question number 10. Would you agree that because God set up the civil government for the purpose listed above, then God's people must be subject for the higher government power, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake? Yes, I agree that Christians should be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake, to people who punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. That's what I think. That's what Paul says. He doesn't just leave it blank. They're voted into office, or they were picked by Caesar. All right? It's not arbitrary. There's a qualification. Both Paul and Peter make the qualification. Those who praise those who do good and those who punish those who do evil. That's what they're supposed to be doing. So yes, be subject to them. Let me know, because I want to be subject to those guys. Let me know if you find one. If you find a minister that's punishing those who do evil, because the police don't do that, they're not going to close down an abortion mill. They're not going to arrest abortionists. They're not punishing those who do evil, and they're not praising those who do good. So let me know if you find one, and I will go submit myself to that guy. God's people pay tribute tax to the higher civil government powers because these civil government powers are God's ministers who attend continually to carry out the duties assigned to them by God as his ministers. Right. Carry out the duties assigned to them by God as his ministers. He doesn't qualify this. All right. He doesn't qualify this. But I just got to know the people, the FDA shutting down farms who are selling raw milk. Are they people who attend continually to carry out the duties assigned them by God? Did God give the government the duty to punish people who are selling raw milk? Did God give the government the responsibility did he assign the duty to the civil magistrate to punish you if your decibel level is too loud at the wrong time of night or in the wrong location? Is that from God? Is that a duty assigned by God to the civil magistrate? Matt, based on the points set forth by Paul to the Roman believers, what is the biblical basis for the Future of Christendom group teaching God's people to do the following? Reject, undermine, defund, deny the legitimacy of legislation, reject and dismantle the state. Well, that's a long way of saying reform the state, because that's what we're trying to do. I mean, most Christians throughout history try to do that, trying to reform the state. That's what Calvin was trying to do with his institutes, trying to reform the state. That's what the people who made America, the framers, that's what they did. They didn't just try, but they actually did reform the state, right? French Catholics tried it, and they got the reign of terror, and we got America ultimately because of the Puritans, in my opinion. So he's like, what's with Future of Christendom? Because again, people, he's like, what's wrong with Future of Christendom, man? Why are you guys saying you're going to reject this legislation and things like that? Because Romans 13 is not the only passage in the Bible doling out the responsibility of the state and the civil government. It's not the only one that talks about it. God's law has a lot to say. God told us how to be a nation before he told us how to be a church. He gave us laws for how nations should operate and the offices and the responsibilities of those offices, and the purpose and all that kind of stuff. He gave us. Romans 13 doesn't set up a new paradigm. This is the same old paradigm we've seen in the Old Testament. But going back to the question, what is it with you guys trying to, reject, undermine, defund, deny legislation, reject, and dismantle the state? Because when he reads Romans 13, if the government passed a law saying you're not allowed to criticize or reform the state, this guy would be like, it's wrong for you to reform the state. It's now wrong to try and reform the state, to speak out against them and say what they're doing is wrong or immoral. If the government passed a law tomorrow saying, you can have free speech, but the only thing you're not allowed to say is the government's in the wrong and the government's not doing the right thing, and we need to hold the government to a higher standard rather than itself, he would say, you can't do that anymore. Why? Romans 13. So it's a completely useless theology as far as Reformation is concerned. It's a status quo proving theology that nobody really believes in. They just use it to stop people who are trying to bring about Reformation in this area. But it's a completely useless theology, because all it does is just say, the states, just let them go, right? They're allowed to do whatever they want as long as they're not asking me to sin, right? Now, nothing in Romans 13 says that the state is allowed to forbid that which God allows. Nothing in Romans 13 says that, but that's what people read. They say the positive, the negative is they're not allowed to tell you to sin, But the positive is they are allowed to forbid that which God does not forbid. That's the application that people walk away from this. Even though God says you can, if the state says you can't, you got to go with the state on this one. If God says, be fruitful, multiply, and take dominion over the earth, right? And the state says, you can't do that anymore. Or the only way you can do it is the way that I say that you can do it. I'm sorry, God, I got to go with the state. Or should I say, it's actually God speaking through the state to tell you how to act, because his word's not good enough anymore. So it's just a really useless theology. We would have never gotten America if we had listened to this guy. If the civil government power is put in place by God for the good of God's people, again, he's assuming he's begging the question here, right? If the civil government power is put in place by God for the good of God's people, yes, the institution of the civil government is put in place. That does not mean the United States government is doing that, right? It doesn't mean that, right? A lot of wicked people call themselves pastors, right? That's also an institution by God. But does that mean they're actually doing what God told them to do and that the people need to submit to them? Because it says in Hebrews 13, submit to your ruler, submit to your church officials, right? For they're in charge of your soul. So that means if they put a speed limit on the road, you got to listen to that one too, right? And no Christian believes that. Yet suddenly when it comes to the state, hey, as long as they're not asking you to sin. So he continues, why would God's people want to undermine, reject, defund, deny, and dismantle it when God's people know that doing such things makes them liable to be punished? Yes, punished by the state, but not punished by God. You think reforming the state is going to be punished by God? Is that your takeaway from Romans 13? That just because we're told to submit, that means that we're not allowed to criticize? That we can't change anything? What if I voted someone in to dismantle the state? Would that make it okay? I just got in an argument recently with somebody who said, I brought up the situation in Acts chapter 16 where Paul tells the police to go pound sand and tell your bosses to come out here and apologize to us for putting us in prison. He told that to the police. And the person I was having a discussion with said, well, he did it in a lawful way. He's allowed to do it, but you're not, basically, right? So, and the takeaway was you're allowed to do it in the way that the state says you can do it. But if you do it in a way the state says you can't do it, then you're in sin, right? Which is a completely lame and contradictory and asinine theology. But I think that's what's going on here. Yes, you're allowed to dismantle the state if the state says you can. Oh, man, that's hilarious. If I ask the questions, above questions to one of your church meetings, would you answer or remain silent? God will deal with his ordained civil government ministers. Oh, man. That's hilarious. So, yeah. Just let them keep murdering babies. God will deal with it later. You just go about your work. Yeah. Don't worry about them. Forget about the Catholic Church. All these other these are authorities ordained by God, right? All authority, right? Doesn't say civil authority. It says all authority. Are pastors authorities or not? Yes or no? The state that's promoting, the drag queen story hour. Just keep going and move along. Nothing to see here. God will deal with it later. Keep going, brother. People just don't take into account Ephesians 5:11. Take no part of the inner workings of darkness, but instead expose them. Even if it's the state, Paul. Even if it's the state, brother. Yes. Even if it's the church. Even if it's your own parents. Okay? Your parents were ordained by God. They are authorities ordained by God. It is okay to hold them to a biblical standard and criticize them when they go out of it. It's okay. It's okay to try to reform your parents if they're wicked. It's okay to try to reform your church if it's wicked. It's okay to try to reform your state if it's wicked, right? But then you have, useful idiots of like what's going on here. And people just trying to get you to stop what you're doing because, Romans 13 says the state's allowed to make you do whatever they want you to do unless they're asking you to sin, which Romans 13 does not teach. His people must trust, and I say that respect. I don't want to call this guy an idiot, but I think this is an idiotic theology, right? I'm sure he's a nice guy, but I think this kind of theology is a very foolish theology. It's not biblically faithful. It's not historically faithful. We have the nice things in this country. A lot of people try to come to this country. We enjoy the freedoms we do because people did not follow this theology. And we got to condemn the framers because they resisted lawful orders from their magistrates to stop what they were doing. They just didn't do it. The Declaration of Independence was a rejection of that authority. And if we embrace this theology here in this email, we've got to stand in condemnation of our framers. And I think a lot of more Christians who are embracing this silly theology are going, yeah, they were in the wrong. Yeah, I've seen them. I've seen it happen. His people must trust that God knew what he was doing when he made the civil government powers his ministers for the good of his people. See, and that is such in my opinion, a privileged and entitled theology to have. They're not saying this kind of silliness out in the Congo where people are getting murdered. They don't have the comfort, right, to be able to sit back at what's going on in the nation and just go, well, God knew what he was doing when he sent those rebels in here to rape my wife and kill my kids. He'll take care of the problem. I'm just going to sit on my hands. Right? I said the term rebels, but that also applies. I mean, it's not just rebels doing that. It's legitimate, ordained, lawful civil government powers killing and raping throughout the world. And this kind of luxurious, live in a nice country, and Hezekiah, as long as I don't see it in my time, silliness is contributing to the downfall of this country, and is contributing to the death and destruction that is going on because it's trying to hamstring the only people that can do anything about it, and that's the Christians. Because if we give Reformation over to the pagans, we're just going to trade one wolf for the other. To me, the civil powers are the ordained ministers and servants of God put in place to execute wrath and time and history on evildoers for the good of his people. That does not describe our country. That does not describe our civil rulers. None of that describes our civil rulers. They're not punishing people who do wrong. They're not rewarding those who are praising those who do good. Right? They're punishing arbitrary lawbreakers. They're promoting God's lawbreakers. And they're punishing those who are trying to take dominion of the earth. That describes our government. That's a more accurate description than I just gave you. But what he said here does not describe. I'm going to read it again. The civil powers are the ordained ministers and servants of God put in place to execute wrath and time and history on evildoers for the good of his people. That's not our country. I can't name one single country that describes. I don't know who's doing this. Who are these people that are executing wrath on evildoers? Who are they? I don't see any. I'm looking around. I don't know who they are. Are you talking about speeders? Drug dealers? Abortionists? Pornographers? I mean, most of the people in government are thieves themselves. They're stealing. They're the most licentious and the most wicked of us all. This does not describe them. For the good of his people, this that's been going on in this country, like the good, like all the destruction and the chaos that our state is causing is for our good, the good of God's people. Why would he say God will deal with his ordained civil ministers and then claim that all this is going on for the good of his people at the same time? How can you make that claim? Why would you say God will deal with his... why, are they doing something wrong? If they're doing something wrong, then how is it good for the good of our people? If they weren't doing anything wrong, then it would be for the good of our people, for God's people. And his people ought not to undermine and dismantle what God has established for our good. Again, does not describe. We're not under. I mean, people who are trying to reform this nation, even the Christian nationalists, are not trying to undermine and dismantle what God has established for our good. That does not describe this country. Doesn't describe this nation. This person seems to be out of touch with reality with respect to him. So that's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully next time we'll take a look at Reformation Red Pill with Dr. Stephen Wolfe and respond to some of the things on there. So thank you so much for listening. Head to futureofchristendom.org, and remember, my friends, think and reform.